Thank you, Paul. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the advisory committee members and everyone else attending. I see there's quite a few DEP staff and LSPs and others here. This is our quarterly waste site cleanup advisory committee meeting. I think we last met in January. And as you probably know, we also are holding monthly office hours in between these advisory committee meetings. So if you haven't attended one of those, you're also welcome to, they happen at the same time, the fourth Thursday of the month. I invite you to check out those meetings as well. I think I'll start, share my screen. So you're not seeing the presenter mode, I hope.
No, Liz.
Thank you.
Looks good. No.
Okay, so just in terms of what we hope to cover today, I'll start by going over a few general updates. After that, I'd like to invite Wendy Rundle to give us an update on the good news, the success that they've had with the homeowner oil spill legislation moving forward. I'll then talk about some PFAS-related updates and go briefly over the PFAS task force report that came out last week, the strategies and recommendations from that report for work to address PFAS across the state going forward. And then we're very fortunate to have Woodard and Curran here to give us a presentation on the study they've conducted on the background levels of PFAS in soil from locations across Massachusetts. Paul and I have already been treated to a preview of this presentation, and I really think this will be of great interest to this group. And then after that, Paul will give us an update on the soil capacity disposal discussions and how that's evolving. And just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded. I'd appreciate it if people stay on mute and you can put questions in the chat. We will also pause as we go forward and allow the advisory committee members to ask questions and if we have time, open it up to others as well. So just in terms of general program updates on the status of work at DEP, we are still operating in a hybrid mode with our staff reporting to the office at least one day a week. Our offices have opened their lobbies to receive packages. So those are open regular business hours, but we haven't yet moved to having in-person meetings. We did have, someone had asked ahead of this meeting whether we were planning on holding this meeting in person, and we haven't quite gotten to that point yet, but I think we're making some progress in that direction. I know, for example, the waste site cleanup management team is meeting for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic in person next week. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think these online meetings are great. Obviously, we never have had prior to going online this number of participants. So that's certainly a positive result of what we've learned from hosting these online meetings, but it would be nice if we could move to some version in the future where we could both have a combination of in-person and people being able to join online. So we're going to be learning about how that works within DEP and DEP technology in the coming months. So More on that, I hope. In terms of other things that are occupying a lot of our time, many of you know that the Boston office is moving, and we're moving to 100 Cambridge Street, and we expect to, we've been told that we should plan on making that move in the fall. I think it's October. That date is still what I've been hearing. Also, more recently, the Northeast Regional Office has found out that they are also moving, and they're in the process of looking for new office space within the same general vicinity of where they're located now. Our office is very much involved in trying to leave our records, not bring our records with us to 100 Cambridge Street. So a combination of archiving and scanning and that type of work is also going on. And in addition to that, there's a lot of hiring that we're doing to try to staff up for work, and also to hire and backfill for the many retirements that have been occurring over the last couple of years or so, and additional retirements that we anticipate. So I know that's also true of many of the rest of you out there, that there's a lot of hiring and retirements happening. And you probably can appreciate how time consuming and yet very important that is. So we're very focused on that. In terms of the status of the MCP amendments, this isn't going to be the meeting where I can go through those in more detail. We don't have those finalized yet. It is an active and very much a priority to finish those. So we're continuing to work on those. And I will hope by the next quarterly meeting that we will be discussing those, if not before. I wanted to make you aware that we're going to be doing another round of the technical assistance grants this spring. Rolling them out this spring. We expect to have an informational session, a 1-hour informational session online in the coming month, late May, early June timeframe, and we will get out the information on that, the date, the link, as soon as possible. So be looking for that as soon as next week. We will make everyone aware of this by sending an email through BWSC information to anyone on our mailing list. We also have maintained our mailing lists for that we used for the TAG grants last year. That includes the public involvement plan groups, community groups. So they will also be receiving a notification. But if you know of a group that's interested, or may be interested, I would encourage them to send us an email, let us know, and we'll make sure we get the word out to them directly. So I'll stop here and see if there are any questions on that before maybe Wendy. Oh, I do have one more. Let me just, you probably had to work very hard to have not heard this news from March, because it was really well covered in the press, and there was a lot of attention to it. It seemed like there was a lot of just real joy around it, which is funny to think, but joy around finally listing the Lower Neponset River on the federal Superfund list. And there was an event which I know Paul attended on behalf of Secretary Theoharides, and that included many dignitaries, Ayanna Presley, Elizabeth Warren, Stephen Lynch, Mayor Wu, and EPA Regional Director, the new Regional Director, David Cash, our former commissioner, was also there. So this was very exciting, and really represents a lot of work getting to this point on the part of the advocates and the work of the DEP staff as well in the Northeast region to get to the point where we can bring federal resources to bear to clean up this part of the Neponset River. So just wanted to highlight that and remind everyone of what a big thing that has been for the program. And I think I'll stop sharing here, and Wendy, if you'd like to maybe jump in.
Yes, great, thanks. So the LSPA is really happy to share that the bill that we've been working on for 3 sessions, which is an act relative to the remediation of home heating oil releases, passed the Massachusetts Senate 2 weeks ago. So yay for that. However, I would say that's maybe even just 50% of where we need to go, but it was a big milestone. The bill was introduced by Senator Ann Goby, and it went through the Joint Committee on Financial Services, and then Senator Rodericks, who is the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, shepherded that through, and it was passed by the full Senate 2 weeks ago. I think it was April 14th. It was unanimous. It was a voice vote, which was kind of interesting so that people could be on the record for supporting that. It gets a new number now. It's Senate number 2830, and it is now at the House Ways and Means Committee. So the LSPA hasn't done a lot of outreach yet with the House. We've kind of set the course, made some key contacts. Our lobbyists are working on this, and we're really hoping that we can give a big, strong push and have it be signed or passed by the House before the end of July. So thanks to all of you who've supported that and written letters and all of those things. Also, many thanks to DP and Liz for your support and your annual report, which we quote. We change our fact sheet and we change our numbers every year, Liz, based on your report. And we also got a tremendous amount of media coverage this past year, or actually really in the last few years. We had TV news, we had WGBH. There was actually even an article on the a piece on the Today Show recently that was a little bit convoluted. You could tell that they didn't get briefed by the LSPA as much as they should have been. But in any case, the awareness is really increased. And Liz, you pointed that out in your annual report, that the number of insurance policies has increased also over the last few years. So anyway, our bill did change a little bit, and that was we initiated that because we thought that it would make it a little bit more palatable on the House side. So what the bill does is it would require that every homeowner's insurance policy includes coverage for remediation of heating oil spills, not just for folks who have oil heat, but for everyone. Insurance agencies or insurance companies can set their fees however they want to. The one change that we did make was that the only time that an insurance company could exclude coverage would be if a homeowner has not brought their system up to date per, Section 38J of Chapter 148, which was the language that was changed about 10 years ago, which requires safety upgrades to the lines or safety valves or some other release prevention measure. We wrote the language very clearly so that a leaking tank could not be a reason for exclusion. It would only be if those specific pieces of the system from that previous law were up to date. And we requested that there be an annual notice, and in the legislation it says 16-point type, so that people who might not otherwise be aware that this could be a problem would hopefully pay attention to that and would understand that they need to do that inspection. That it was a compromise that we actually initiated. There was some discussion behind the scenes. We didn't get a really hard pushback at all from insurance companies. about this. And I think that it will help us a lot with the House. And we felt that it was a reasonable thing to include. So anyway, we go onward. Time is running out. The legislature deals with the budget, obviously, this time of year. And we're hoping that they won't forget about this bill. But anyway, it's been a few years. Liz knows it's been longer. Liz and Paul know, a lot of you actually know that this has been a longer effort than just the last 3 sessions. So anyway, we're seeing some positive momentum, so we'll keep it going.
Wendy, does the bill specify who does that inspection? That was the sticking point in the original bill years ago.
I just checked actually the law yesterday, and it says that the inspection needs to be by a licensed technician. So, and that's defined in the law. I don't have more specifics than that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wendy, it's Michelle O'Brien. I
Yeah,
have my hand
yeah.
up. I'm going to lower it. So I know the bill, or a bill, passed in prior legislative sessions. It passed one branch and not the other. And I forget which way it went. So had it passed the Senate previously and got stuck in the House, or did it pass the House previously and get stuck in the Senate? Do you remember?
No, this bill, our bill, there have been some others that sound similar, and those have all died in committee. So I don't think that has happened, what you just said. I know, I mean, I would know for sure if that had happened anytime in the last 3 sessions. But it has passed obviously through committees, and maybe that's what you're thinking, is that as it has been passed through various committees, we have publicized that. But this is the first time that the entire Senate has passed it.
Okay. I thought it had passed one branch and not the other, but it doesn't matter. That's great news that it passed the Senate. Do you know, and I saw Barry's question in the chat,
No.
is there a new Senate bill number yet? Or maybe
Yes,
they haven't
the Senate bill number, no, the Senate bill number is 2830.
2830
So
is the new number.
So if you look on the Mass Legislature website, you should see that bill language under 2830. So evidently it gets a new number before it goes to the House. So it is at the House Ways and Means Committee now under that number S 2830.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I see there's some questions in the chat, and I can, there's a question there. It doesn't, I don't think it gets a House bill number, Susan.
No,
I think
it
it stays
shouldn't.
Senate. Yep. I'm looking at I think that's all the questions from the chat.
I think you've addressed those questions. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. That's such great news.
Keep you posted.
I know we get questions all the time within DEP about the status of that. There's very much a lot of people within the Wayside Cleanup Program hoping that that will be successful.
Yeah, that'd be terrific. I mean, it would be wonderful to have relief for these folks, and relief that's not government relief that comes from the private sector. It just seems entirely fair that it should be the insurance companies.
I'm just looking back at the chat. I see Peggy Shaw has addressed some questions about the tags. I did not, and I should have gone back and kind of explained for those of you who aren't that familiar with what the technical assistance grants are for, in terms of offering grants that groups can use to help them better participate in a disposal site cleanup, whether it's hiring experts to help them interpret information or doing outreach and that sort of thing. And it is open to municipalities as well as groups, which can include PIP groups, but it's not limited to PIP groups. And I think I may not have mentioned as well that this year we were planning to up the amount of the individual tags to 20,000. It was 15,000 last year when we did it. That's the plan. Some of this is still subject to change, but we should have more information on that at the information session and once we post the materials. I think are we all set to move on? Any other questions so far?
Liz, I just put something in the chat. I guess a question. So if you're in one of the towns that had private well testing and there were wells in your town that had no source identified, but were above the MMCL, is it a possibility to get a TAG grant for further assistance in regards to that?
With respect to the testing or with
Whatever the town feels might be necessary, like maybe do some additional testing or soil testing or do like a townwide, forensics evaluation or something. I was just wondering if that was an option.
Yeah, I think there are some limitations on using it for generating original data. And it's more goes to resources for interpreting data that exists. But,
So paper studied, but not.
Yes.
Okay. Paul looked like he was going to say something.
Well, I was going to partly say, point that out. Also partly point out that the tags are for 21E sites in some of those cases where we have that we're not kind of dragging them quite immediately into the 21E system. But if it's a neighborhood where there are a lot of hits and wayside cleanup is doing like site discovery, we've assigned it an RTN and there's a lot of work going on, then that certainly would be something that would could be an option for a tag, but not to do the actual field work. It would be to help the residents understand what's going on, interpret the results that are being generated either by a PRP or by the state if we're doing that work. And given, I can think of several towns now where that situation is the case, and the residents certainly could and should get together and apply for a tag because whenever you have a neighborhood or area of town that's affected widespread contamination with PFAS, there are a lot of questions, and it would help to have kind of a separate independent resource that people can go to talk about.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving on. Share my screen again. Not sure why I'm back here. But okay. So next I want to talk about a little bit about the status of the public and private well sampling program, and also run through the recommendations coming out of the PFAS interagency task force. So the public and private well sampling program, the free sampling programs that have been offered and running this past year, are preparing to wrap up by the end of the fiscal year in terms of the end of the contract to do that work and the funding. So you will notice if you go to the websites where we used to have the ability for you to register for the private well sampling program, for example, that they've taken those registration forms down, but there's still much work that's wrapping up, and many ongoing sampling projects that are still part of those programs that are still happening and will happen for the next few months. Just to remind you that this information is available, you can go find it online, both public water supply testing as well as information on the private well program. And there's a story map available to show where, for example, there have been detections in the public water supplies and the status of that sampling. So you see here just kind of a summary of where we are with respect to public water supplies, that over 1,000 have been tested, both community and non-community, of the 1,400 or so that are required to test. 116 of the public water supplies have detected PFAS in the finished PFAS-6 in the finished water above the 20 nanograms per liter maximum contaminant limit. And there's information online available if you go to the story map, tab 4, about how the public water supplies are responding to these detections and actions they've taken to date. And you can also find the test results through the EEA data portal link that is there. In terms of the private well sampling program, as you know, or you probably know, that it is focused on those 85 communities in the state where greater than 60% of residents rely on the use of private wells. There have been 4,677 homeowners to date that have applied for the free sampling through that program, and 1,766 are now sampling or are ready to sample. So they're still processing many of the sampling of those wells through that program. And to date, 95% have been found to be below the maximum contaminant level. 7 have tested at an eminent hazard level, the 90 nanograms per liter eminent hazard level, in excess of that. But I do want to highlight that those are just the private wells that have been detected directly through this program. There have been additional eminent hazards found in private wells when DEP then goes to do follow-up work to look at wells nearby, the ones that are initially coming in through this program. So as you know, the waste site cleanup program gets involved at this point in doing additional testing, in providing in issuing access agreements to do that testing, and providing POET systems to homeowners that have imminent hazard levels in their private wells. So there's a lot of work that is initiated under this private well sampling program that we then follow through on, where we have found these higher levels. Moving on, I just want to spend a little bit of time running through the recommendations of the PFAS interagency task force that was issued last week. And I suggest, if you haven't already, you check out, you can both see the press conference when they announced the report, and as well as you can find the final report at that link. The interagency task force has been meeting for the last 10 months or so. They were established by the legislature to look at PFAS across the state and the exposures and all the many issues related to it, from sources, consumer products, use by firefighters and firefighter exposure, contamination of public and private wells, and other sources of exposure and potential impacts to public health. So they have issued this, the group, the task force is 19 members. It included DEP's commissioner, Marty Suberg, as well as representatives from EEA, DPH, Department of Fire Services. Jeffrey Arps and LSP was one of the task force members. So they have met and engaged with stakeholders over the last 10 months at hearings to hear about all of these different issues, and have summarized all this in the report, along with their recommendations for going forward and potential legislation related to it. So the task force has organized its recommendations around 8 different strategies and 30 different recommendations. Here are the strategies over here on the left-hand side that include funding PFAS detection and remediation of PFAS. There are 5 different recommendations related to that. Many of these, it would involve DEP, including funding DEP and DPH to do testing of environmental media for PFAS beyond drinking water and groundwater, surface water, wastewater, residuals, soil, air, fish tissue. Fund MassDEP to continue its investigation of PFAS sites and sources, and establishing a PFAS remediation fund with grants to municipalities, public water supply systems, and homeowners for the capital costs and operation and maintenance costs associated with PFAS remediation or treatment. There are also recommendations related to environmental justice communities, including increasing loan forgiveness percentages for projects addressing PFAS contamination in communities eligible through the Disadvantaged Communities Program, and making information accessible in accessible languages about PFAS exposures to affected communities. There's a series of recommendations related to phasing out the presence of PFAS in consumer products, which include prohibiting the sale of PFAS, intentionally added PFAS in those products by 2030, and funding research on alternatives. And in terms of expanding regulation associated with consumer products, they are recommending defining what is considered PFAS in consumer products as fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. Other PFAS regulation proposals include that when MassDEP drinking water program reviews the maximum contaminant level for PFAS, that it consider establishing standards beyond the current PFAS 6, and incorporating PFAS into permits for groundwater discharge from industrial wastewater and into pretreatment of industrial surface water discharges. In terms of private well testing and treatment, there are proposals to encourage municipalities to require PFAS testing of those private wells by requiring the PFAS testing be done at the time of the transfer of the property or with new well permits, and creating funding to go with that for communities to receive and distribute loans to homeowners for private well PFAS treatment. Also looking at identifying strategies for lowering the cost of testing for PFAS in private wells. There are many proposals related to supporting firefighters and local fire departments. Some of those also related to the work MassDEP has done with respect to the AFFF Take Back program. They're recommending funding a second round of the Take Back program to collect and dispose of AFFF, to decontaminate storage facilities and equipment, and to provide funds to firefighters for purchasing fluorine-free foams for fire departments. Also looking at prohibiting the use of AFFF for firefighter training and maintenance activities, and requiring that when PFAS foams are used, that notification be made to MassDEP. There are also several recommendations related to occupational exposures to firefighters and reducing that, as well as tracking and assessing that type of exposure. There are proposals related to liability and accountability for PFAS, including identifying a path for adopting reasonable limitations on liability claims for both claims against homeowners as well as municipalities, and directing MassDEP to work with the Department of Defense to implement the Department of Defense's guidance that they issued at the end of last year on sampling public and private drinking water wells and initiating removal actions where there are exceedances of our state's maximum contaminant level. And finally, there are proposals or recommendations related to enhancing public awareness of PFAS that direct MassDEP and DPH to do public education efforts, as well as DPH to provide guidance to healthcare providers on PFAS exposure. So I think, have I come to the end? Yeah, so I'll stop there. And if there aren't, are there any questions, follow-up comments, anyone who's maybe more involved in that effort want to make comments about it? I did see from the press conference, one thing I meant to mention, that in terms of the timing of this, that there are some bills related to PFAS and funding that are currently in the legislature. So Representative Hogan, the co-chair of the committee, mentioned that to the extent that those can move forward this legislative session, they would be looking to do that, but they expect a complete bill to address, the range of recommendations here in the next legislative session. Okay, so I don't see anything, and with that, I think we can move into yet another PFAS-related topic, which is to invite Woodard and Curran to share with us their presentation on the study they've conducted on PFAS background levels in soil across locations across Massachusetts. As I mentioned, Woodard and Curran gave this presentation to both Paul and me a few weeks back. And at the conclusion of that, we asked them if they wouldn't mind also sharing it with the Office of Research and Standards and others. So they came back a second time and did the presentation for Mark Smith, the Director of Office of Research and Standards. Nancy Bettinger was there. Nihar Mahanti, who works on PFAS and leaching, was there for the Office of Research and Standards, as well as Kathy Baskin from the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Water Resources, and several other staff. So they got an opportunity to see the presentation and ask a series of questions and suggest other, areas of interest for additional research. So I think you'll find this very interesting. We really appreciate Woodard and Curran coming to us and sharing this information with us. And I'll just, I guess, turn it over to Lisa. And Lisa, I think you all should be able to share your screens, and Lisa can to get started.
I'm trying, Liz, to share my screen, but it's saying it's disabled by the host.
Ooh.
I just fixed it.
Okay.
I was going to say, that sounds like a Paul question.
It still says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, that might be me. Okay, try now.
That's working. Okay, let me
Yay.
let me figure out which one I'm sharing. This one. All right, everyone got that?
Yep. Looks great, Sam. All right. With that, we'll get started. Thanks for the introduction, Liz. And this presentation is going to be sharing the design of the study and the results of a self-funded study that Woodard and Curran conducted across Massachusetts to try and understand what background levels of PFAS would be in the state. Next slide, Sam. So just as sort of a backdrop, this slide is showing just the general conceptual site model for how PFAS may be entering the environment. There can be direct discharges to groundwater by industry, and also waste streams that go to wastewater treatment plants. And then there can be surface water or biosolids impacts from that. There can be direct stormwater discharge and runoff from industrial sites. Those are the things we try to avoid in our study, and really focus on what the impacts from various deposition from the atmosphere would be. And there's 3 types of deposition that can occur from the atmosphere to surface soils. And one is that there can be gaseous pollutants in the atmosphere that are part of dry deposition. There also can be particulates that from the atmosphere that are deposited on soil. So those are both the dry deposition. But also, as I'm sure many of you have heard, PFAS can accumulate in cloud water and come down as rain or snow, or, you know, like in Massachusetts, hail and whatever else we have, as part of what we call wet deposition. So our study attempted to capture, you know, the impacts from all of these types of deposition to the soil. And stay tuned, because we also did a rain study that was partially funded by a West grant that we're going to be presenting, I think, at the May 18th LSPA meeting. So more on that. Next slide, Sam. So what were the drivers for this study? I remember when we first started talking about regulating PFAS a few years ago, there was a lot of murmur in the audience from stakeholder groups like, well, they're forever chemicals. They've been used in so many things. They're going to be ubiquitous and everywhere. So how are we going to distinguish what might be considered background from, you know, a release related condition? How do we tease that apart? And this was a particular concern for PFAS because the standards are very stringent, and they only seem to be getting lower and lower in the states that are currently regulating them. We have yet to hear where EPA standards are going to land, but you know, we're regulating these at the part per trillion level. They're I think the most stringent standards for contaminants that probably have ever been derived in the US. And so this can really drive cleanup at sites. So it became really important, we thought, to understand what is the contribution from these anthropogenic sources that have existed, you know, for decades, that can be impacting soils. And that is our focus. I think some things that we discussed with DEP that obviously are going to require further study are things like, you know, how much of what's found in soil is really leaching to the underlying groundwater, as well as, you know, are there background levels that might be present in the state for groundwater? But our focus is strictly on the soils. And with that, I think next slide, Sam. And then one other thing we wanted to point out, you know, that there have been some sort of very small scale background studies around sites in particular, but we really wanted to capture what exists in the absence of a, you know, identified site. There have been several regional studies that are either have been completed or are ongoing in New Hampshire. The Vermont study was completed a couple of years ago, and those were considered as part of the MassDEP MCP Method 1 standards. And we also do some comparisons that you'll see of our data to the Vermont data. And we're awaiting anxiously to see New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut background soil data. All 3 of those are in progress, and we're hoping to see them soon. And the only national study we could identify was for Sweden. Leave it to the Scandinavians to be ahead of the curve. It's a small country too. So that's sort of where things stand in terms of background soil studies that we feel were pertinent to Massachusetts. And I will turn it over to Sam.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Study objectives. Lisa touched on some of this already, but really looking to understand PFAS in undisturbed soils really was the focus here. We wanted to make sure we could evaluate the regional differences and make sure that we had really good distribution across the entire state. As Lisa indicated, we wanted to be able to compare to these other studies that have taken place or are ongoing. And then Lisa Mack will get into the implications around those standards. So to do this, we had really three primary challenges that we needed to overcome. One was identifying those background locations, right, that undisturbed soil. The second was getting access to sample those properties. And then the third was figuring out a way to do this where we're not creating MCP reportable conditions for based on the data we collect. We also want to make sure we consider our sampling methodology, understood the material that we're collecting the samples from, and then obviously QA/QC, make sure we have a good solid data set. So to start, we looked at all the open spaces across the state. This map is showing. The other thing that this map is showing is the MassDEP regions, right, which are these dashed lines. For our study, we adjusted the region slightly, and that's what these solid lines are, just to have better distribution across the state. They're pretty similar to the MassDEP region, but we would want to point out there's a slight difference there. So once we had these open spaces plotted, we looked at those open spaces relative to potential PFAS sources, right? That's all using the information provided in MassGIS. And so this sort of zooms in a little bit so you can see a little bit better all the different sources that we were looking at here, but things like fire stations in red, locations of airports, these resource recovery facilities, which are those potential air emitters, all the different 21E sites, including AUL sites, landfills, military bases, right? All these things, making sure that we were selecting those background locations that were not going to be impacted by any potential sources. So from there, we were able to narrow this down and really look for these properties with no known sources. Also looking at the history or historical uses of any of these open spaces, make sure there's no potential historic impacts of PFAS. Again, making sure we had good coverage across the state. And then we also needed to be able to access these properties like we talked about. And we did get approval to collect these samples through research grants. And ultimately, this is what our study ended up looking like. We collected 100 samples from 25 open spaces across the state. This is the distribution of the samples collected. So we ended up collecting 4 samples from each of these 25 properties. There were, we don't talk about that here. The number of samples is essentially correlated with the area of the size of the regions, right? So a fewer samples in the Northeast, more in some of these bigger regions. Okay, getting into the sample procedure. So from these properties, again, we collected 4 samples from each one, making sure that they were distributed throughout the properties, and from upland areas, accessible by trail, but making sure we were off the trail, and we were primarily in mature forest. The samples were collected from the top 6 inches of soil. We made sure to remove any leaf litter, debris, that kind of stuff, making sure we had soil. Because it's PFAS, we all know the sensitivities with collecting samples for PFAS. We made sure we were collecting or following good sampling protocols there. And these samples were stored on ice and sent to the lab under chain of custody protocols. And this is my dog Zoomer, who helped with collecting some samples a couple times with me. So diving in a little bit deeper into this, the MCP reportable implications there, right? We didn't want to create MCP reportable release. And so to do that, we created a double-blind study, which meant that we don't know specifically where any of these samples were collected from. No one does. We did not record any location information, any coordinates, any information about the specific properties that samples were collected from. So we have a sample ID that looks something like this, where we recorded the region a sample was collected from. We recorded the type of soil, the habitat, right? In this case, it's forest and sand. And then we have this 1A here that represents the sample, right? So with sample A through D from property 1, but that number was not assigned by the sampler, right? So the sampler would fill out all the information, then keep these samples grouped together, bring them back to a handler who would then randomly assign a number to that group of samples. So the handler doesn't know what properties those samples were collected from. The sampler doesn't then know what number those samples got assigned. We also made sure to collect at least 2 samples from at least 2 properties each day, so that the date was not an identifiable characteristic. And then duplicate samples, field duplicates, we were worried about collecting additional volume, right? And that additional volume required for a duplicate could be could be identifiable, right? Would be something memorable that would allow us to associate that sample with a specific location. So to avoid that, we had the lab select which samples the duplicates would be collected from. And so the lab didn't know which properties, right, the samples were collected from. We didn't tell them which samples to run the duplicates on. So no one knows specifically which sample was collected from what properties. Okay. So the samples were submitted to Alpha. We want to make sure to thank Alpha for their support with this. They partnered with us on this study as well. The samples were analyzed for 36 PFAS using isotope dilution. We also had the lab run TOC and percent solids. For the QA/QC samples, we collected 8 duplicates. We ran 8 duplicates. The RPD was up to 19%. So all within range. We had 3 field blanks and 1 equipment blank, and those were all non-detect. Okay, so now Lisa Mack is going to tell us about the good stuff.
The big reveal. Let me just put this, I can't see the bottom of the screen. Just fit it to the window. Okay, so what did we find? So we looked for 36 different PFAS and we detected 9 among the 100 samples. So, overall, not all of them, but, the big hitters were there. PFOS and PFOA and PFNA were detected the most frequently. So the chart on the left here shows the frequency of the 9 different PFAS that we detected across the board. So that's across all 100 samples. And the range that we saw for each of these PFAS was generally pretty small. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a chart that shows the maximum and the minimum detected concentrations for each of the 9 PFAS. PFOA and PFOS had pretty high, well, I say, well, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but they had a larger range of variability. Some of these constituents where you see the maximum and the minimum detect equivalent, that just indicates they were only detected in 1 sample. So we saw PFAS detected at every single property that we evaluated. So that's pretty significant. And only out of the 100, only 12 samples were entirely non-detect. Next slide. And so here's a map that shows the PFAS distribution and concentrations by region. So these are our study regions again, similar to, but not quite the same as the MassDEP regions. So you can see we have a Western, Central, Northeast, and Southeast. And you can see there's a little bit of variability among the different regions and what kinds of PFAS we saw and what the levels were. So Central, for example, had the highest concentrations of PFOS, but then Southeast had the highest concentrations of PFPEA. So kind of interesting to note the differences there. And really, we didn't see a whole lot in the Northeast region. And I like Lisa's comment there. Next slide. So we found 9 PFAS. We really want to focus for this talk on the PFAS-6 for those are the ones that are currently regulated in Massachusetts. So that's PFDA, PFHPA, PFHXS, PFNA, PFOS, and PFOA. PFHXS, we did not detect this in any of our samples. So that one is, well, I'll be referring to PFAS-6, but really it's the PFAS-5 because we don't have PFHXS detected. So when you look at our results, our total PFAS concentration, so that's of the 9, we had concentrations up to about 19 parts per billion. The PFAS-6 concentrations comprised the majority of that total concentration. Next slide. So looking again at the occurrence of PFAS-6 by region, here again the 5 of the 6 PFAS for the Northeast, Southeast, Central, and Western regions. And you can see again, there are some slight differences in how frequently these individual PFAS were detected, but overall it's relatively consistent in the distribution of the types of PFAS that were detected among the different regions. So next slide. Here we have some box and whisker plots that show that distribution of the data by the different regions. So the gray is central, the teal color is northeast, the light green is southeast, orange is western, and the navy blue is our statewide results. So all the data pooled together. And again, you see a pretty consistent pattern among the different regions. So although there's some variability, the concentrations are pretty similar. And actually, if you were to run a statistical test looking at that, if there are differences in variability, there really is no significant difference. We did look to see if there were outliers. You can see looking at the box and whisker plots, for those of you who may not be familiar with these, that box represents, that little line in the middle of the box represents the median. Those bars represent the spread of the data. And you can see a couple of dots that extend beyond, up above those bars. And those are considered potential outliers. Again, if you look at the y-axis on both of these charts for PFAS and PFOA, the range is pretty small. We're really only looking at a couple of parts per billion difference overall across the entire data set. So while these are maybe considered potential statistical outliers, really, we wouldn't even call these out as a hotspot or anything if we were looking at this, from an exposure point concentration. So I think that's important to note that even though there are differences, the overall range is very, very small across the entire data set. The next slide. So here's just a different way of looking at the data, again, across the different regions as well as statewide. This chart presents the median and the 90th percentile concentrations. So the median is represented by the green bars and the 90th is represented by the navy bars. And again, you can see overall there's pretty good agreement across the different regions. Some regions have slightly higher concentration, but really it's a matter of 1 or 2 parts per billion. One thing to note, I did mention that PFH excess was not detected. When you look at the detection limits, there was, for some PFAS compounds, slightly higher detection limits observed. So in the case of PFH excess, and you can go to the next slide, Sam. Oh, no, I guess it was on the other slide. No, you can keep going. I'll talk about that in a minute. Sorry about that. We also collected organic carbon, as Sam mentioned earlier. We wanted to see if there was any kind of correlation between PFAS concentrations and organic carbon. And surprisingly, there wasn't really any good association between the two. So we looked at total PFAS. We also looked at individual PFAS, and we got pretty consistent results. So to us, that was pretty surprising, actually. We thought there would have been more of a correlation there. Next slide. PFAS concentrations in Massachusetts, Vermont. So the green bars here, the green box and whisker plots show the Vermont data distribution based on that Vermont study. And the navy is the Massachusetts study results. So we see, again, a pretty consistent pattern in the types of PFAS detected and the concentrations detected in both studies. Massachusetts concentrations were somewhat higher. Again, if you look at the y-axis, the concentration spread is still over a pretty, with small, less than 10 times spread in the data set. So pretty similar concentrations, but Massachusetts did have slightly higher concentrations overall. And so hopefully in a year or two, we'll be able to update these charts with additional data from the different New England states, which would be pretty cool. Next slide. So comparing our data to the MCP standards, when you look at it on a statewide basis, we had about 60% of samples above the S1 GW1 standard. We didn't have any concentrations above the S2 or S3 standards, just the S1 and GW1 standards. So that's good news in many respects. But for GW1 based standards, we had 90th percentiles and 90th percentile concentrations exceeding those standards. So for PFOA in particular, we had 39% of samples had higher concentrations, PFNA 31%, PFOS had a lower frequency of exceedances at only 14. So I had mentioned PFH excess a little bit prematurely earlier. So that particular compound was entirely non-detect, but that the reporting limits for those for PFH excess, I think it was approximately 70% of those samples results had reporting limits higher than the the standard. So again, fairly significant, and I guess somewhat surprising in that, we had soil samples, low, low percent moisture, high percent solids, nothing too crazy with the TOC. So it's a little surprising that we had the elevated reporting limits there. Next slide. Here's just a different way of looking at the number of exceedances of the S1 GW1 standards by region. Again, you can see there are some differences among the regions, but in all regions, we do have some exceedances, particularly for PFOA and PFNA. Next slide. And lastly, here's a chart that just compares the S1 GW1 standards to the Massachusetts 90th percentile based on our data set and the Vermont 90th percentile based on the Vermont study. And those 90th percentiles form the basis for some of the current MCP Method 1 S1 standards. So as you can see here, we have exceedances for a number of the the PFAS-6 compounds in Massachusetts. Just to note, those little rain clouds on the side, we're not really talking about our rain study results today, but these compounds that are flagged with the little rain cloud were also observed in our rain samples. So kind of interesting, particularly for PFNA. So next slide. So what does this all mean? Like I said earlier, we don't have any S2, S3 exceedances. We don't have any risk from direct contact. If you take the 90th percentile concentrations and you throw those into the method 3 short form, you don't have a hazard index greater than 1. So good news, these are all recreational areas that we looked at. So it's, that's a good thing that came out of this is that even though there is this background component of PFAS in these pristine soils, they don't pose a risk for somebody who could be playing or visiting those properties. With regard to ecological risk, the numbers that we found in our study are basically below a lot of the data that's available for ecological effects in some types of organisms, such as plants and invertebrates. What we've been seeing in the data is that for plants and invertebrates, parts per million levels are really those that cause adverse effects, whereas we're seeing part per billion levels in our study. But there are uncertainties associated with that because number one, we have lacking data for many different types of PFAS. And number two, a lot of those numbers that are out there don't really take into consider bioaccumulation. And some of the PFAS in particular, like PFOS, do bioaccumulate and biomagnify up through the food chain. So next slide, I think I'm turning that over to Lisa.
Oh, okay. So we have, thanks, Lisa, great job. We have a number of additional presentations planned that are listed here. Well, obviously we're doing the SAC meeting right now. And we're doing one for, I can't even pronounce the acronym of NOEPIC next week in Lowell, and are talking with the LSPA to present this to the entire LSPA community, hopefully in the near future, as well as working with some other groups to see if we can present in other venues. But a key thing is we are currently working on a white paper and are hoping to prepare a paper to publish these findings so that they can be citable and referenceable by, everyone in the scientific community. Because we're not able to share our slides yet at this point because we have not, sort of documented this in a paper for publication. And next slide. So at this point, like Liz said, we've presented this to a pretty broad range of folks at DEP, and we wanted to continue to work with DEP and assist them in evaluating and hopefully considering our data as part of standard setting, as well as helping to highlight, I think, some points for further study that I think many of you are aware of. And certainly DEP is, like NIHAR, working on really trying to understand the leaching potential of PFAS from soil to underlying groundwater, as well as maybe getting a better sense of, are there background levels in water in Massachusetts? I was just going back and forth with Paul in the chat a little bit. I mean, I think it's very interesting that we had a pretty high number of soils, these unimpacted soil samples above the S1 GW1 standards. For some of them, 30 to 40% of the samples were above, for like PFOA, for example, above the S1 GW1, whereas we're seeing a much lower percentage of private wells and public water supply wells exceeding the 20 parts per trillion water standard upon which those S1 GW1 are based. So it seems as if, maybe we can also use that data to inform if we should be adjusting some of our soil to leaching numbers. So I think that's it. And I think if both other presenters can be on, we're happy to answer people's questions.
Thanks, Lisa. I think I'll just open it up to everyone. If anyone wants to ask questions directly of Lisa and other presenters.
I've been trying to answer the ones I saw in the chat
Yeah.
as we went along, so.
Do you want it, Lisa? Do you want to just run down those questions that were posed? And
Sure, I
Mhm.
think, yeah, I mean, there weren't many. So I think someone just wanted us to confirm the depth from which we collected these samples, and they were all collected from a 0 to 6 inch depth interval, really focusing, like we said, on surface impacts from the various depositional transport mechanisms. I had to tell Diana we can't share our slides now because, like we said, we're working on a paper to publish it, but until it's really referenceable and citable, we're not going to be releasing our slides to the public. We did not send the data out. I think Susan asked that for validation. We just had the lab QA/QC from Alpha as well as an in-house review. Were there any exceedances of other S1? And the answer was no, correct, Lisa?
Right. So again, I mentioned we didn't exceed any direct contact criteria based on the concentrations in GW2 is not really relevant, and GW3 is protective of surface water. So that's you're looking at a much higher bar there for that. But we, so there were only S1 GW1 exceedances. And I think, I can't remember if we mentioned earlier, was it about 40% of our properties that we evaluated were within GW1 areas?
And I think Barry just asked what kind of soil types, and Sam, we did indicate.
Yeah. So we did look at that and include that in our sample IDs, but primarily our samples were collected from loam type material with some that were some sands and silts, but yes, we did distinguish.
And then I think someone just asked, were any MCP reportable concentrations exceeded? So we actually did sort of look, like we said, we did a double blind study. So there were no, regulatory reporting obligations that were, triggered. But if we just kind of look at the locations that we sampled from, those 25 locations, I think Sam looked to see how many of those were actually in GW1 mapped aquifers or areas, and what was that percent?
It was about 40% of them.
40%. Yeah. So we can't attach a particular location, a particular sample to the S1 GW1, but my guess is that yes, there would have been some reportable concentrations triggered, because like we said, for some constituents, we had almost 40% of the samples above the S1 GW1, and 40% of our locations, those 25 locations, were in GW1 areas. So it's likely that there might have been some samples that would have triggered that. And Susan has her hand up very patiently.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a few questions. One, I asked about the validation, and the reason for that is because, as you know, especially at these low levels down near sample quantitation limits, validation often can change a number. So that's one thing you might want to consider before you publish your work, just so that your means and your 90th percentile are based on data that are verified. The second observation I had is for TOC. I've seen really variable TOC from lab to lab, depending if they use a combustion method or persulfate, depending if they do the quadruplicate analysis in the Lloyd-Kahn method or not. So just because you didn't see a correlation between TOC and PFAS doesn't mean there isn't one. You might want to look at the TOC data a little more carefully.
Thanks. Paul, did you have a question? Oh, okay. You lit up for a second. Let's see, anything else in the chat? Okay, well, Liz, I guess if people have additional questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I will, confer with the team and get back to you.
That's great. And again, thank you all so much for bringing this to us and also agreeing to come present to this wider group. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic. Having more information about what the background levels are around the state. So it's great to have this data set really consistent with kind of information the state, even the legislative report wants us to continue to gather. So I really appreciate your time and also offering to have people reach out to you with additional questions. And so at this point, I think we have one remaining agenda item, which is Paul coming back to talk about the soil disposal capacity discussions and any recent developments on that since we last covered that topic. So Paul, I'll just turn it over to you. I think you might have something to share.
Yep, hopefully I can do that. And while I'm setting that up, a couple of things. One, for the PFAS work, it will be interesting once we have finished like the private well sampling program, which does come to an end at the end of this fiscal year. And when we have a chance to get all the data in and look at that, to look at what we're seeing in groundwater at these, somewhat randomly selected locations across Massachusetts, kind of look and see whether we're seeing the same things and the same ratios as what you guys may have seen in the soil, and eagerly anticipating the precipitation presentation as well. So we'll have all of these data sets that there's probably a lot that can be done in looking at them and kind of going through and mining them for information. So we have that to look forward to. The other thing I was going to mention, when Liz mentioned that at the Neponset River event for the Superfund, that I was there with the dignitaries, and I think she mentioned the secretary as well. And I guess we should point out that it's now the former or soon to be former secretary, Katie Theorides, was announced that she was stepping down yesterday. Which is bad news because she's been great to work with. The good news is that Beth Card is stepping in as Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And as you all probably know, Beth has, she's great to work with. She's incredibly smart. She also comes from DEP, among other places, including MWRA, but
oh, Paul, you're frozen. Is everyone seeing Paul frozen or just me?
No, he's frozen.
He froze.
Yep, frozen.
It's kind of an interesting look, but
to know that Beth is there and she
you didn't know that.
Paul, you froze for a little bit. Are you
back? Am I back?
Well, you're back.
Okay. Well, I was lauding Beth Card's being appointed as Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. I hope you got that.
We did hear. I think we heard most of that.
Yeah. So that's all very good. And of course, I have internet connection problems because I am sitting in the office and I'm hardwired into our network.
Yeah. So my advice is to, well, maybe too late, but
go home back to my basement
with the Wi-Fi in the office.
Yeah.
Just one of many reasons why we're looking forward to moving to 100 Cambridge Street. I hear the internet is better there on the other side of the hill. Soil, and then we can all go home. So I think I'm sharing back to a slide that we've talked about before, coming out of the December 2021 listening session about soil, which was very sobering. And there were a number of things that were listed, and you can go back and look at them about what the private sector can do. And then these were the ideas, which were not necessarily, all of them aren't necessarily things that we can pull off, but this is what people thought that DEP should start moving ahead on and trying to tackle. So the good news is, let's see, over here. So the first one are changes to COM 15 to allow less than RCS2 remediation waste to go to COM 15 facilities. We've worked internally to discuss this and came to an agreement that where it makes sense, the regions will work with any facility that is an RCS2 facility to work with them to change the ACO and the soil management plans for that facility to allow for the less than RCS2 remediation waste to go to these facilities. To be clear to everybody, it does not involve a change to the actual acceptance criteria, but this eliminates that weird little glitch in the MCP where you can have exactly the same soil. If it originates at an RCS2 facility, it's not remediation waste. An RCS2 location, it's not remediation waste. It could go to an RCS2 reclamation soil facility. But if it started out in RCS1 location, the concentrations would be greater than RCS1. That makes it remediation waste, and that changed what you can do with it. The concentrations could be exactly the same. The nature of the soil is exactly the same, but its ultimate destination would depend upon where it started from, which didn't seem to make sense. We wanted to make sure that the ultimate location is risk-based, it's environmentally sound, and it's based on what the actual concentrations are. So the regions, if a RCS2 facility would like to modify the agreements in order to allow to be able to take in these materials, we would encourage them to do so. And I believe there's at least one facility that's moving along, making progress towards that. So that's one thing off the list. The other things that I wanted to kind of talk about today they're kind of related. Facilitate using soil across projects as well as within a project. Particularly, this came up in cut and fill projects where you may have one project, one site over here that you need to remove soil, but you need soil on another project. Same PRP, same, but different locations, different sites. Whether there's something we could do with that, and then it was also suggested. To allow, and it came up as COM 97 soil, but I would say, let's generalize it to any soil being used at other 21E sites. Particularly the example used here was where you need to deal with rising sea level and resiliency, and there may be a demand for soil to raise the elevations in some areas, that could be done using reusing soil from 21E sites. So we are looking at that. A couple thoughts on that, and we're talking about these. We don't have great progress to announce, but some thoughts going into it as we're considering this is really focusing on that there has to be a need for the soil at the receiving locations. And in some of the discussions that we've kind of kicked around are things that potential projects that we've heard about. It can't be a kick the can or kick the soil down the road situation. There has to be a need for that soil, or a real use for that soil at the receiving location. We don't want to create basically just new disposal sites, new dumping grounds. It's kind of a loaded term. Temporary or even permanent just stockpiles of soil. And it's not something, people should be doing just because it makes economic sense. And by that, somebody can make more money by taking in more soil. There really has to be a need for that volume of soil at the receiving location, a purpose, a beneficial use, if you will. Again, a loaded term. It's not a BUD, it's not a solid waste issue, but there has to be a need for it. And when the soil gets at that receiving location, I think it's fair to say that its placement and its ultimate future use has to be consistent with a permanent solution at that location, not simply a temporary solution, a temporary resting place for that. And the owner of the receiving facility has to be really aware of what they're getting into, because there are, one of the reasons we're going slowly in this is that there are a lot of potential liability issues that have to be clear, have to be worked out, and you can't jump into this lightly. And we want to make sure that, if we're to consider anything like this, everybody has to be aware of what's going on. And you've seen this chart before. Since the last time we talked about it, I added the bottom line because somebody had mentioned dealing with soil with asbestos-containing material, and that gets an to go along with it. But we're picking off again the things in the upper left-hand corner. What I was just talking about really are the second and third columns are the same PRP at different 21E sites and different PRPs at different 21E sites. Those, I think there's certainly a possibility that there could be some progress made in the near future dealing with those. And obviously, the more contaminated the material is, the harder it becomes to deal with it. So that's kind of the progress we're trying to make following that dotted line down the road. And those are just a list of other things. So that's kind of where we are with soil issues. And from my new position, I could say that the issues we're dealing with soil also come up in other programs. I'm working a lot with solid waste and working a lot with the management of wastewater residuals and that type of thing. And the landfill capacity issue, the difficulties finding out of state disposal options, that are local and don't involve driving hundreds of miles, are affecting all across the board. So it's not hard.
Paul, you might want to try without your video. I don't know if it helps. You froze again. There you are.
I shut my video off.
That's better.
Because my internet connection is unstable. Did you get any of that?
Yes, I think we got most of that. Did you see the one comment from Lisa in the chat?
Oh, no, I haven't looked over there. And so this is something I should have mentioned earlier on. As we look at the chat and try to answer chat questions, it probably is good to read the chat comment so that everybody can, including on the video, will do it. So I'll do that. Lisa says, as part of soil capacity discussions, please consider potential impacts and exacerbation if municipal biosolids also need to be disposed of if further regulated for PFAS. We are painfully aware of that, but I think it is important to point out again that the capacity issues are only going to get worse as we need to dispose of things that in the past we've been able to reuse successfully, and biosolids is potentially one of those. And let me see if I can find something while you're all. Well, do you have anything else, Liz?
No, there's no other question for you there. Are there any additional questions for Paul? You don't have to chat, you can just jump in.
Nothing?
Seeing nothing.
Well, you're not going to give me time to find the picture I wanted to find. Ah, here we go. Okay, I did come up with a solution to the biosolids problem, but and I think this is politically the most the easiest thing to implement when it comes to biosolids in PFAS. And we all know the classic children's book. I think we have to re-edit that. Again, probably the most politically palatable of all the options for dealing with PFAS and biosolids.
Is that the most feasible?
It's the most feasible, yes.
Thanks for that, Paul. Okay, well, thank you. And I'll just give everyone one more opportunity if there are any other lingering questions before we say our goodbyes.
Liz, I just wanted to jump in. I think I sent this question to you, but I think at one of these meetings, so everybody can think about it till the next one, we need to revisit the makeup of the advisory committee and what is our role and how we should be, what's the succession? How should we be replaced? Or is this like the Supreme Court where it's a lifetime position? So I'm thinking of that in terms of getting, younger people involved. Yeah, not that I'm, not young, but young at heart anyway. So I'd like everybody to think about that. I really think it's important that we have representation from younger people, different areas, and decide what this makeup should be and what our role should be and how we communicate back to our constituents. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so Susan did reach out and suggest we have another discussion about this. Some of you may know we focused at least one meeting last year and had some recommendations of ways we could encourage new participants in the committee and expand participation. And, this suggests what you just said, your last comment, Susan, about how to communicate back. I don't know if we've discussed that, but that this all makes sense in terms of revisiting that. And, I would say let's put that on the agenda for our next meeting. And that will give us a little bit of time for the committee members to think about it, but as well as the rest of the attendees. And we would really appreciate your thoughts as well. We have had kind of an open invite over the last year, trying to seek other membership and trying to get more representation from underrepresented groups. And as you said, one discussion was younger participants. And we really haven't had anyone really coming forward, but we haven't also had a sustained sort of push for that. So yeah, let's take that up again with the committee at our next meeting.
Thank you.
Any additional comments, questions before we sign off? Okay, well, seeing none, I thank you everyone for being here today. There was one question about where will the recording of this meeting be located? It's on our it's on our MassDEP waste site cleanup page. If you search on waste site cleanup advisory committee, we we put them there. All I do is Google it to get there. So that would be my suggestion to you to find it. But yes, it will be, the recording of the meeting will be posted there.
You can also look on our YouTube page, which would be youtube.com/MassDEP. And there's a playlist for that includes past advisory committee meetings, and this one will be up front.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, well, thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I would say when our next quarterly meeting is, but I'm not exactly sure whether it's June or July. So I'll have to update you on that. I think it might be June. I think we recognize that people take off for the summer. So it's not too long from now. Yes, Paul gave me confirmation on that. So hope to see you in June, and keep in touch, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And thank you, Woodard and Curran. One more.
Yes, definitely. Good job.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Bye.